Running out of time. Chapter 8. The woman who had herded Jessie and the others together walked right behind Jessie, so there was no chance to break off and escape. Teenagers, the woman snorted. The word sounded vaguely familiar to Jessie. She thought it might be like okay and shut up, another word from the future not allowed in Clifton. But why did the woman say it so angrily? Jessie gave up wondering and looked around. They were heading down the same corridor Jessie had crept through the night before. But in the bright light from those miraculous glass globes, now Jessie noticed pictures on the wall. Moving slowly toward them, Jessie saw they weren't paintings or drawings, but something else. Something that seemed to capture scenes just as someone might see them. They were incredible. How could such pictures exist? Jessie remembered Mr. Smythe telling the school about a new invention called a daguerreotype. But she'd only half believed him. It sounded crazy that someone's image could be captured like that. And, of course, she'd never actually seen a daguerreotype. The first one in the United States had been taken only the year before, in 1839. Maybe that's what these were. Why, she'd be the first person in Clifton to... Suddenly Jessie realized how silly she was being. Everyone else walked by the pictures as though they were nothing. The rest of the world had seen hundreds of these daguerreotypes, probably. And she had to remember, this was 1996, not 1840. Then, Jessie noticed all these scenes were from Clifton. Mrs. Harlow cooking over the open fireplace, Mr. Seward measuring out a poke of flour for Mrs. Riddle, Mr. Smythe looking stern as the school children stood and recited. And yes, Jessie was in that picture, in the 5th grade row. She looked younger, but it was definitely her. Jessie looked around, wanting to tell someone how strange it was to see herself as she'd looked 2 years ago. But she couldn't. That was the last thing she should tell anyone. Remembering the danger, Jessie moved away from the pictures. She tried to walk at the center of the group, cautiously, so no one would catch her staring. She looked around at the others, and she got another jolt. A few of the children, she discovered, were actually Negroes. At least their faces and hands were a shade or two darker than Jessie's. Some of them had curly hair, but others' hair were straight. Jessie had never seen a Negro, and she was disappointed that their skin wasn't pure black and their hair pure curl, as she'd always heard. Jessie didn't think they could be slaves, because they acted just like all the other children. Maybe the abolitionists in Clifton had gotten their wish, and there wasn't slavery anymore. By this time, the group was beyond the door Jessie had come through the night before. A bit farther down the hall, Jessie saw a woman wearing a long dress, apron, and bonnet. It made Jessie feel better to see someone dressed like that, but the woman wasn't from Clifton. The group of children reached the woman, and she motioned for them to stop. "Good morning," she said, a little too cheerfully. "Welcome to Clifton. My name's Mrs. Spaulding, and I'm going to be your tour guide today. I understand you've come on a school trip from," she looked at a card in her hand, "Oakdale Junior High." Some of the children mumbled yeses. Any adult in Clifton would have reprimanded the children and ordered them to say, "Yes, ma'am," promptly and crisply. But this Mrs. Spurning only smiled. "Well, we have quite a treat for you today. This'll be like going back in a time machine. When you left for school this morning, it was 1996. Here, it's 1840. The people here live without TVs, VCRs, stereos, refrigerators, freezers, or even running water. How do they survive?" One boy with spiky yellow hair asked. Several around him laughed. Mrs. Spurning ignored his smart-alecky tone. "They survived just like many of your ancestors did. Some would say they live better than you because they aren't weighed down with your possessions." "I doubt it," the boy said. The others laughed again. Mrs. Spurning forced a smile. "Why don't you wait and see?" She continued, speaking dully, as though she'd said the same words many times before. She sounded like Mr. Smythe when he repeated poetry at school. But Mrs. Spurning was describing the history of Clifton, as Ma had the night before. Mrs. Spurning kept calling it Clifton Village. "Do the people here really think it's 1840? A Negro girl with spectacles asked. She looked really smart. So Mr. Whittingham was wrong when he said Negroes couldn't think like white people. Jessie listened carefully to Mrs. Spurning's answer. "Oh, these people aren't crazy," Mrs. Spurning said with a laugh. "Only the youngest children think it's 1840. All the others are let in on Clifton Village secret as soon as they are old enough to understand. No one speaks of it, though, because they are happy here. And they do get some benefits of the 20th century. Medical care, for example. It would be inhumane to let anyone die of the diseases that many died of back then, when antibiotics are available now. But that's not, Jessie started to protest. Everyone turned to look at her, and Jessie realized she couldn't call this woman a liar. Not now. No one would believe her. That's not, authentic, Jessie finished lamely. She cleared her throat. I'm not saying I want anyone to die, but how do we know this is really what 1840 was like? Now, that's a good question, isn't it, children? Mrs. Spurning said in a sticky, sweet tone. She seemed to be making fun of Jessie. We could never be 100% sure. And things like 20th century medical care will always make Clifton Village a little different from any real village of 1840. But we've researched everything about this period, and Clifton Village is as authentic as possible. Now, do we want to talk about it or see it? She turned, obviously meaning for the children to follow her the rest of the way down the hall. As they troped behind her, the girl with spectacles came towards Jessie. She was sure mean to you, the girl said, and it was a good question. I've been reading a lot about this period. People lived in really filthy conditions then, but I doubt it if we see filth today. Oh, Jessie said. She would have liked to tell the girl everything and ask her all about 1996 and ask her if slavery really had been abolished. But after almost giving herself away, she knew she had to be careful. The guards weren't chasing her anymore, but there was still danger. She wasn't allowed to relax until she told Mr. Neely about the diphtheria and got medicine for Katie and the others. My name's Nicole, the girl was saying. Nicole Stevens. My parents didn't have any imagination. There are 2 other Nicoles in my class. Oh, Jessie said again. She'd never met anyone named Nicole. It was pretty. I'm Jessie. Mrs. Spurning saved Jessie from having to say anything else. She stopped the group and began explaining the system of mirrors and cameras that allowed them to see everything happening above ground. They were under the village square right now. She pointed to an image in a wide stretch of glass, and Jessie saw Mr. Harlow pull up his wagon to the store. It was like the pictures back on the walls of the corridor, only Mr. Harlow was moving like in real life. One of his horses was missing a shoe, and Jessie had to stop herself from yelling out to him to get it fixed. He walked into the store, seeming unaware that 30 children were watching him. Off to the side, through each of these doors, you can see what's happening in the various shops and in each of the houses. Our monitors tell us, Mrs. Spurning glanced at a box above the group's head. There's bread being baked at Dr. Feister's house. The potter is making bowls, and the blacksmith, oh, you should see this, come along. She led the children to a door marked, Joseph Kaiser, Esquire, Blacksmith. Inside was a room with about 50 chairs, more than could fit in Pa's shop. But against one wall, full length, was a clear image of Pa bent over a horseshoe, glowing red. Jessie could hear the crackle of the fire behind him and see the sweat flowing down his face. For a minute, Jessie forgot she wasn't standing in the shop herself, perhaps having stopped in after school to see Pa. But she couldn't feel the heat of the fire, and all these strangely dressed future children surrounded her. Some were snickering. Couldn't he find an easier way to do that? One boy asked. Shut up, Jessie said. He's the best.